Well, thank you very much, Larry, for that very kind introduction. Larry is a partner, a leader, and a mentor. I've learned, I could speak here for hours about the things I've learned from him. I also want to thank you, Noel, and also the FPA for this award. It's a great honor. I have no idea why you asked me to be up here, but it's a great honor to be here. And the thing in reading about the FPA, because I didn't know that much about it, and that's shame on me, one of the many, many elements of what I think you do is to get people to engage. You get citizens to engage, you get leaders to engage. And that's really what I wanted to just focus my remarks on, which is business leaders engaging. And I think if ever there's a time for business leaders to engage, it's now. We're obviously in an extraordinary time of change, uncertainty. I think it was Nicholas Eberstadt in a recent commentary magazine, which to me summed it up and said, you know, we in Western nations are seeing an ominous and growing divergence between three trends that should ordinarily move in tandem: wealth, output, and employment. And in that environment, I think it's very important for business to step up. I think there's three ways that we can do that, or we should do it. One is by running our businesses for the long term. As Larry mentioned, this focusing our business, focusing our horizons more for the long term creates better businesses and actually a better society. But in the last, I think, 30 years, we've shifted much more to a short-term, less inclusive type of capitalism. So business needs to drive it from that point of view. I think, secondly, business needs to speak out more about why the system that we think works, trade, the free flow of capital and people, is important to what we do. And at the same time, we should be more in touch with what actually is going on, and probably spend a little less time talking to each other about the issues. And the third is, I think, that business is uniquely qualified to deal with some of the broader societal challenges that are out there. We're going to need a new social contract. We're going to have to figure out how to rethink education. And I think business is uniquely qualified and must do that. So those are the three areas I just wanted to focus on. It all comes actually from having a capitalist view. You know, in McKinsey, we're called many nasty names at times, and we deserve them. But the one name or phrase I do like is we're known as the Jesuits of capitalism. That's one I like. So we have to fight for capitalism. And actually, if you get carried away with that, and you look at sort of what I think is the leading philosopher of capitalism, I say philosopher of capitalism, is Adam Smith. And if you ever are so bored as to read his first book, which is not talked about probably for a good reason, it's very painful to read through. It's called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He makes a couple of comments that have really hit me. He says, and it's really about the engagement of business in society. All the members of human society stand in need of each other's assistance and are likewise exposed to mutual injuries. The wise and virtuous man, this is obviously many decades ago, woman as well, is at all times willing that his own private interest should be sacrificed to the public interest. It's the duty of the entrepreneur to take care of the society in which they operate. I wish Milton Friedman had read more of Adam Smith and what he was doing. So just to the 3 points quickly. I think, again, the idea as business leaders that we focus more on the long term is something that we've lost sight of over the last 30 years. We did some work with FCLT, which Larry mentioned, which showed that 55% of CFOs in the top 500 publicly listed companies would not make net present value positive investments if it meant missing their quarterly earnings target by 1 cent, right? Just a short-termism pushing people to what needs to be now as opposed to what we need to do in the future. We just did some recent work with the FCLT, and it's in the Harvard Business Review, and Adi's been a main supporter all the way through on this, trying to understand the impact of long-termism versus short-termism on company performance, but also on the broader country. And we looked at the US in particular. And if you look at what happened from 2000 to 2015 at 615 of the leading companies in the US, about 21% of them were long-term. We had an index for this. The rest were short-term. Those long-term companies over that time frame increased their revenues 47% more than the shorter-term players, their earnings 36% more, spent 50% more on R&D than the shorter-term players, created 12,000 more jobs per company compared to their peers. And that has a significant impact on the economy in terms of the number of jobs that were created, the R&D that's done, and so forth. So there's a link between business leaders being long-term and also what happens in the environment that they're in, and we need to do something on that front. The second is this notion of business leaders being a little more in focus with what's happening as a result of capitalism, because there's a lot of people that have been dislocated through trade, through automation, the creative destruction, and so forth. But also, at the same time, I think we better have a voice about why we believe the system works. As I said, free trade, the free flow of capital, and the free flow of people, including immigrants, in through it. It is vital to the way that our system works, and we better stand up and talk about that and when we move it. I won't bore you with lots of data. Again, we all know about the rising inequality. We all know that there are literally, hundreds of millions of people in OECD countries that over the last 15 years have experienced a decline in income and where they are. So people have lost out from the greater pie that we've actually been building with capitalism. We better recognize it, because if we don't, we're going to see some of the things that we're seeing now. And it's not someone else's problem. I think if we think it's someone else's problem, we're going to pay the consequences of where that is. But we also need to remind ourselves that capitalism has led to the increase of GDP 6 times over the last 50 years. 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. The average person alive today is about 8 times richer than a century ago. There are many, many benefits, but there are obviously a lot of disruptions, and we need to be aware of them and play a role in figuring out how we deal with that as sort of a second role. And the third, as I mentioned, is I think there's a very legitimate and important role for business to play in dealing with the system. We shouldn't take it for granted. So when I think about education, one of my heroes is Randall Stephenson at AT&T. Randall Stephenson is one of the most hardcore capitalists that I've met. He's very focused on business performance and the competitive position of AT&T. But he's also someone who said that, a third of my workforce will likely not be capable to work in my organization over the next 5 to 7 years because of technology change, automation, and so forth. And rather than say, I'm just going to find another third that can do it, he provided a training program through Georgia Tech, Utah City, and others to retrain people at AT&T. He's retrained 120,000 people, right? You volunteer. He doesn't force people. You have to do it. It costs some money, but it's done part-time. And that, in my view, is an Adam Smith capitalist, right? Taking care of the people and the society of where they are. He's someone who's done a lot of sessions, Black Lives Matter and so forth, not because he thinks it's a socially responsible thing to do, but he's got a lot of employees that have been affected, and so lives it in that way. And when I think also about ourselves in McKinsey, we're very good at writing reports and making comments about various things. One of the areas that we're very focused on is youth unemployment. But as Larry said, the difference between talking about it and doing is very important. And so one of the things that we launched about 2 years ago was a program called Generation, which is in our philanthropic arm in the firm, to basically focus on educating unemployed youth to be able to get jobs. And our ambition is to get 1 million unemployed youth back into the workforce. We've 10,000 that has happened to now. We're doing this in 5 countries, and it's scaling at about 550%. It takes about 3 weeks to train someone to get a job. These aren't rocket scientists. They're nurses' assistants, cashiers, and so forth. But when you see what you can do with people with less than a high school education in a 3-week period to get them job ready and stay, it gives you a lot of hope in what we do. And that's just it's a small piece, but I think more of us need to do that. So I think, again, thinking about the broader role that we need to play, thinking about the social contract that's going to have to be built for people that are going to be losing their jobs more frequently as automation comes in, has to be partly done by business leaders. We cannot assume government is going to do that. So I hope with those 3 areas that we as business leaders focus on, we can help make this kind of uncertain, dynamic world a little more stable for people, a little more inclusive for people, a little more long-term for people, and a place that will be a great place for harmony as we look ahead. Thank you very much.